Mr. Kessler's talk. He makes you feel like you're in 1911 again, and I know you'll enjoy it. My pleasure, Mr. Ad Kessler.
I brought a picture of my friend. Perhaps some of you have seen him. Perhaps some of you have not. Anyway, he hasn't changed. He hasn't changed a bit. That's Ishi, the way he looked August the 29th, 1911. He was poor and hungry. I have other pictures here. I don't know that you may have to look at them after you get through here. They're mostly just where he was found. Pictures of where he was found out on the Old Quincy Road. Now, the Old Quincy Road is not Olive Highway, and it is not Highway 70. It's a continuation of Bridge Street. And it goes out about 2 miles. There is a marker out there. By the way, that marker is put there, and the person responsible for it is a teacher up here in the high school, Mr. McInturf. His little boy, Jeffrey, and the family had taken a summer trip, and they had seen a lot of country. They had seen a lot of markers along the road. And when they come back from the trip one evening, the boy was sitting in front of the fireplace, and he asked his dad. He says, "Dad, we've seen a lot of markers on our trip." And he says, "They're very interesting." He says, "How come that Oroville or vicinity does not have a marker?" His dad says, "Well, can you think of some particular incident or something that happened where there should be a marker?" Well, he says, "Yes, Dad." He says, "Down here by the old slaughterhouse," he says, "that's where they found Ishi." Well, that's true. So they started from there. They took it up with the state, and they took it up with the native sons and daughters of the Golden West. The results are that you have a marker, which I think is very nice. And by the way, if any of you are standing at that marker and you look off north of that marker about 75 yards, that's the exact place where Ishi was sitting the night that I found him. Now, I'll try to tell you as I remember it. It's pretty clear in my mind. I've forgotten a lot of things, but it seems like that story, I've told it so much I believe it myself. But this happened one evening when we had just got through slaughtering. I was up in the change room changing my clothes. The other boys, which was a man by the name of Dell Lovelet, another one by the name of Diamond Dick, and another one by the name of F.W. Kroger. While we were there was a boy about 8 or 9 years old. His father run a dairy south of the slaughterhouse, about 300 or 400 yards. The boy was alone most of the day while the father was in town. And the boy would get lonesome, and he'd come down to the slaughterhouse to watch us kill, and just as company. In the evening, when things were over, he would go up in the big corral, which is the one facing Quincy Road. Those days we did not have any trucks, so we had to have the old horses. He'd bring the horses down and tie them up to the wagon. And this particular night, he took a halter He started up there and he put his hand on one fence that he climbed over to get there. And this fence is around 7 to 8 feet high. And it was made out of heavy plank, like 2x8s, because there's where the cattle came down on the rush, and sometimes they'd turn around and it had to be a good fence to hold them. Well, this time, as he put his hand up on that fence, between the cracks of the boards, he seen a man, or presumably a man, sitting with his back against the wall of that barn. And such a matter like this, only to clear down. My bones don't bend, Ishi. And he was frightened, and he yelled to me, "Ad," he says, "there's a man here." Well, I understood that. But I said, "What'd you say?" He says, "There's a man here." Well, I knew there shouldn't be a man there, because this was around about 7:30 in the evening, and we were getting ready to get out of there, and it should not be any strangers. I was pretty near dressed. I had on a pair of riding boots and some long johns. So I went over the corral, and as I went through one little corral, I picked up what is known as a hog gamble, about that long, about 1.5 inches thick, made out of oak. They put that through the hog's hind legs when you raise them up. I picked that up as a weapon, and I come over to where the boy was. I asked him, I said, "Where is this man?" He says, "Right in there." I looked in and I seen what I thought was a Mexican. We had trouble with Mexicans coming over at night and cutting up the beef, helping themselves. So I shaded over this fence, dropped down alongside of this Indian, and I pushed him over and raised this club. He showed no resistance. He was scared. He put his hands on the side of his face like that. He muttered something like "Chico, Chico." So I see he was an old man. I see he wasn't properly clothed. So I reached down, I got him, and I pulled him back up in a sitting position. And I talked to him. I got no answer. At that time, I could talk pretty good Spanish, and I talked to him in Spanish, but there's no response, just no response. I used a little profanity. He didn't understand that either. So the other boys down on the floor, killing floor, they hollered up, "What do you got?" I said, "I don't know. Better come up." And the foreman came up, and I asked him, I says, "Bill, would you sit here with this fellow? I'm going to call the sheriff and have him come out and get him." I says, "He's starving. He don't look as though he's had a meal in months." He says, "No," he says, "I don't want nothing to do with that guy." So my old partner, Diamond Dick, that wasn't his real name. His real name is Louis Cassens, but he'd rather be called Diamond Dick than he would to have a rib steak. So I called him, and he came up. I said, "Dick, would you sit here and entertain this boy while I go down and call the sheriff?" "Sure." So over the fence he got, and he sat down in front of this Indian. So I called the sheriff, who was John B. Weber. And I had worked for him one time and knew him very well. And I told him, I said, "John, I've got something out here at the slaughterhouse, and I don't know what it is." I said, "It hasn't got all the clothes it needs." And I says, "It's got big, hard feet." I said, "It's not a Mexican." But I said, "I don't know what it is. I think you should come out and investigate." He says, "Listen, my boy, this is your idea of a joke. And I come out there," he says, "I'll bring you back with handcuffs on you." I said, "Okay, John, you come out." So after about half, 3/4 of an hour, John Weber, the sheriff, and a constable by the name of John Tolan, they showed up, and they come on down to where this Indian was sitting. I was sitting directly in front of him. I had a old barn lantern on the right side. And when Sheriff Weber looked at this man, he says, "That's an Indian." I says, "Well, if it's an Indian, he ought to be able to talk, hadn't he?" He says, "Well, maybe." So John could talk good Spanish. He talked to him. "No," he says, "nothing to it." I says, "I gave him a smoke." By the way, the little comedy with that. Before the sheriff came out, I was sitting there in front of him. That time, I smoked Bull Durham's tobacco. Had it in my shirt pocket here. Unconsciously, I just sitting there in front of this Indian, Ishi. I took out a paper and just tobacco, and I rolled myself a smoke. And I lit it, and Ishi looked over there, and his eyes got big, and he pointed at that cigarette and pointed at his mouth. And he done that 3 or 4 times till I figured out what he wanted. So I took a paper, and I handed it to Ishi. I gave him my tobacco. He done all right, only he poured out so much tobacco he could roll a cigar, and he broke the paper. He done that 3 different times. So, and another thing, each time he put the tobacco in his own pocket. There was one pocket in that shirt that he had, and he put my tobacco in it. So the 4th time I started to give him a paper, then I held up. And I reached over and I got the tobacco out of his pocket, and he laughed at me. Give me a great big smile. And I put in just enough tobacco to make a cigarette. I rolled it up, wet my lip, and wet a little bit, and I handed it to him. And he looked at me and he was happy. But he wanted like that. Well, as a sign reader, I took it that he wanted a match, wanted some fire. But those times we were using what we call block matches. Sulfur and brimstone on the end, and they come in inch square blocks. And you can light them right on your hip, or you can light them anywhere on the rocks, but you could light them. And if you put them up to your face too quick, you get a whiff of sulfur. Well, I gave Ishi one. He looked at it. He examined it. Then he took it. I made a motion for a rock in front of him, and he broke it. Well, there was another little piece there. So he took that, and attempting to light that, he broke that. He looked on, about as disgusted as you could be. So I gave him another match. Same thing happened. He did that 3 different times. So I took his hand, I put a match in there, like that, and those eyes of his sparkled. He was still holding on his cigarette, and I motioned to the side there on a rock, maybe 4 or 5 inches across, and it had fire. I raised his hand up, and Ishi got a light. Well, he put that match up there very quick. Really my fault. And he got a whiff of sulfur when he inhaled on that match, that cigarette. And he made his nose, moved around to beat the band. But he took it as a joke. He smiled. And he put that cigarette in his hand some way. The fire was in the palm of his hand. It was shielded, and he'd smoke, and he was happy. He'd get a big smoke out of that. Now, the reason he put that cigarette, the fire in the palm of his hand, can be of 2 reasons that I think. It could be one, if he was in the woods, he'd be shielding himself from an enemy or from the wind to blow his fire out. But he smoked that cigarette until there was just a very fraction left. He dropped it in front of him. And when he looked down at that little piece of cigarette butt, I noticed the lobe of each ear had been pierced, and a piece of buckskin about 2 inches long had been inserted in there. There was a knot in front and a knot behind to keep it from falling out. That was in each ear. Through his nostril, he also had a pierce. There was a piece of wood in there about the thickness of maybe a diamond match. But it was very prominent. You could see it. And I looked. I pointed at just like this. He just smiled. He wouldn't say anything. His feet, he was barefooted, were as hard as saddle leather. He'd be able to walk over broken bottles, thistles, or anything of that kind. It wouldn't hurt him. They were hard. I reached over and got him by the toe and to feel his sole of his foot. And when I touched him, he started laughing, smiling rather. And he had on, all that he had on, underneath there had been one time a undershirt, and it had unraveled until there was not very much left, only a few threads up here. Outside of that, he had on a blue denim, or had been a blue denim one time. The color had changed quite a bit, and not for the best. But it was a shirt similar to what the Mexicans used to wear, and a Chinaman used to wear it in the mines, on the railroads, on the section foremen and section gangs, and in the mines. All he did, it opened up to about here. You slipped it over your head. He had that on. That came down just to his knees. I took a hold of that jacket to see what it was, what it made out. Well, he'd had it a long time. It was pretty well set up with, I think, bear grease, the way it smelled. So when the sheriff came, he says, "Did he have anything with him?" I says, "Yes, just what he's got on." He says, "Well, you put these on him." He handed me the handcuffs. So I took Ishi's arm, put a handcuff on it. I took the other one, cuffed it up. I thought perhaps when he couldn't get his hands apart that he just about hit the floor, but he didn't. He was the happiest boy you ever seen. He smiled, pointed like that, as much as say, "For me," or "You've given them to me." And I nodded my head. Sheriff says, "You better lock arms with him, because it says if he gets a starter, it says, take 4 saddle horses to catch him." I said, "All right." So I just put my arm up through his arms, and we walked that way up to the sheriff's buggy. He had a 2-horse buggy. So when the sheriff and the constable got in the buggy, I motioned for Ishi to get in. He just hesitated a second, and he's crawled right in. He got down on his knees, kneeled down, put his hands on the dashboard, and there he sat, just like any 3 persons in a buggy. And the sheriff took off for downtown. Well, the other boys, they'd had the wagon all loaded for light stock, pigs, sheep, and calves that we were bringing in that night. So we followed the sheriff on down the hill. When the sheriff passed Downer Street on Montgomery, there was a saloon there called the Senate Saloon. And there was 4 or 5 men standing out in front. And they looked there, and Ishi showed up very plain. He showed up very red. Quiet, he wasn't saying a word, and he wasn't doing anything. But he was just holding on that dashboard and looking. And the sheriff kept on going down to Huntoon Street. There he turned left and on up to the jail. They took him in. We pulled into our meat market, which was just about a block this side of the jail, and we pitched in and got unloaded. I told the boys, I said, I'm going over to see what they're going to do with that fellow. I said, he's mine. I'm going to see what they're going to do with him. So I went over and had quite a crowd in that jail. Ishi was sitting over in this corner. There was a counter here. The sheriff and his deputies were here. Ishi was in there. When I come up, I edged my way around, and I came over and I stood by Ishi. And he looked up at me. I don't know if he thought, well, here's a friend, or are they going to kill me or what? There was a big question mark in his face. He was in there, I guess 10 minutes, or I was in there 10 minutes anyway, when the trustee brought up what, if I remember right, was either a biscuit or a donut. Handed it to Ishi. Ishi took it. He got up and he smelled it again. He looked at it and he turned it over, back and forth, give it another third smell. Now, he didn't throw it down, he didn't put it down. He just opened his hands and it fell down out of his hands. Sheriff said, no, it wasn't the sheriff, it was the undersheriff, a man by the name of Will White. He says he don't want anything like that. He says he'll go for some frioles, beans. So he told the trustee, he says, go on down to the Tin Can restaurant, which was on Montgomery Street, which was a beanery. For 15 cents, you got a big bowl of beans with a green onion and 2 slices of bread and a cup of coffee. And the beans are hot. So this trustee went down there and he came back. He had this bowl of beans, had a napkin over the top, and a big spoon in there, tablespoon. And he handed it to Ishi. Now that pot was hot too. Ishi took it, he gave it a smell, and he was looking. He took that spoon, he drawed it across his lips and his tongue, and he cleaned it up good. Then he threw it on the floor. But did he go to town with his 4 fingers this way? And occasionally he'd clean them off across his lips. And he cleaned up that big bowl of beans, all inside. Hardly need any washing. He had it white. But he was hungry and he enjoyed that. It made me happy to see him eat. So the crowd kept coming. And they started asking, who is it or what is it? And sheriff says, damned if I know. So after about an hour, hour and a half, sheriff says, well, you better put him upstairs. He says, put him in the insane cell. That was the padded cell. Now, there was only one reason why he put him in there. He was alone. He couldn't put him in the tank where there was other men, because in the tanks there'd be some rough people in there. The reason they put him in this cell, he couldn't hurt himself. The walls were all padded. The couch was bolted to the floor. The undersheriff says, Butch, says, you want to walk with him upstairs? Sure, I'll walk with him. And we're old pals, just like that. I took him by the arm and I walked up the stairs with him. Turned to the left, down to this one cell. And Ishi stood inside, then he stood around, he faced that door just like that. And I felt sorry for a man. When I pulled the door shut, I just felt for that boy. There he was, all alone. He didn't have the least idea what was going to happen to him. And his life had been pretty rough, really rough. Closed the door, turned the key in it, and he stood right behind them bars and looked. When the last of us went down the stairs, he was still there. In the morning, when I passed the jail, the jailer was out sweeping off the steps. And I asked him, I says, "Bert, what happened to my boy last night?" He says he never slept a wink. He says, "I seen him sit down once. The rest of the time he stood up in front of that door." Well, after, let's say, around 8 o'clock, the crowd started to come. Reports had got out. There was reporters here from Sacramento, Chico, Marysville, wanting to know about this wild man, as they called it. The crowds got big enough where the sheriff told the trustee, "You take him out there on the lawn." He said, "I don't think he'll leave, don't think he'll give you any trouble." But he says, "Take him out on the lawn and watch him." So he did. This trustee and this Indian were out there on that lawn all day, except noontime when they fed him. And that kept up for several days. They brought him out to the slaughterhouse. I think this was on a Friday or Saturday when we caught him, but they brought him back out Monday. 2 deputy sheriffs. And the dogs got to barking, and I looked out, and I seen the sheriff coming down with, and right behind him was Ishi. So I told the partner there, I says, "Well, we're going to have company." He said, "What's coming down?" I said, "Well, our Indian and a couple of deputies." So they stopped out about, 20, 30 feet from the slaughterhouse door and got under the shade of a little tree. Ishi right away flopped right down on his haunches. So I went out there. I had on my slaughterhouse tools and knives and steels, dirty clothes, and I made a motion, Ishi, like that, about his hair. Now he had long hair, as you can see. It don't show up very good here, shows a little browning. But his hair was not as long as a hippie. And I wanted to know how he cut his hair. So I made a motion back. Finally, he got the idea. He reached over and he got a handful of dry grass, about that big around, rolled it in his hand. Then he made a motion he wanted some fire. I gave him a match. He wasn't very accustomed to matches because he'd break them. Then he'd look at them. So I showed him how to light. I put it up short in his fingers, then took his fingers across a rock, and he got fire. He lit this dry grass, and he blowed on it to get a flame. And he passed that back and forth over his hair. When it would go almost out, he'd blow on it again to get more fire. He did that until the grass burned to his fingers. He reached down and got a handful of dirt, and he rubbed that through his hair. Just give it a good shampoo with dirt. Then he looked at me and he smiled, much to say, "Well, that's the way we do it." Then he looked on and he made a motion like that. The deputy sheriff, one the fellow named McKee, he says, well, you ought to take him home. You and him are getting along fine. He says, you and he'll be talking here pretty quick. Well, that was their idea. They wanted Ishi to leave, but he wouldn't leave. So he kept making that motion for his mouth. I thought he wanted a drink of water. Well, we had to carry our water out there because while we had running water there, it was not very good to drink. And we carried our water in a milk can and ice. So I hollered to one of the fellows, I says, bring us up a can of water. He did. That time, we used to have what we call a 3-pound lard bucket. It used to be 3, 5, and 10-pound containers for lard. This was a small one, a 3-pound. And it was pretty near 2/3 full of water. Handed it to me, and I handed it over to Ishi. Ishi smiled. He took a good big horn of that water. And he looked in there, and he made a motion like that. I figured there's something in there he wanted, so I just nodded my head. It was a piece of ice, about the size of a hen egg. And when I nodded my head, he went after it, put it in his mouth, and he chewed it up. You could hear him chewing it too. One of the deputies, McKee, he says, we're going to give him to you. I says, maybe. He says, you keep talking to him. He says, and will back up slowly and back away. And he says, after you get his attention, he says, then I'll back up and get away. Well, Will, he did. He backed up. He got as far about 15 feet. McKee started to back up, and he got back about, say 10 feet. And I was busy playing with this Indian, but all of a sudden he turned his head. Things were quiet back there. And he seen his deputies going back up the hill. He started up right away, right after him. They wasn't going to leave him there. It was only a few steps until he was up with them. Well, when he was in jail, so many people came and asked the question, who is he? What is he? And finally, the sheriff says, we're going to give him a name. We have to name him. He says, we'll cut off part of that, Izzy. They just kept the last 4 letters, Ishi. That's where Ishi got his name, from Sheriff John B. Weber. There is a book wrote by a lady, Ishi in 2 Worlds, that says that her husband gave him that name. That's an error. So they had him here in the jail, had him out on the lawn. Finally, there was a telegram came from, I think it was St. Louis, from the Midwest, from a lady, that if the sheriff didn't know what to do with that man, she'd come out and she'd marry him. Well, that didn't go far. But the next day or so, here come another one from a man. He had a carnival, either Oklahoma or right in that area. And he wanted to come out and get him, put him on exhibition. Because all the papers, you might say, in the whole United States had big accounts of him. He was a big news gatherer. The next telegram came from San Francisco, from the agent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And he told the sheriff, he says, anybody wants to put that man on exhibition, arrest him immediately. He says, from what I can understand, he says, that's an American citizen. and you do not put American citizens on exhibition. So that stopped that. The next thing was a phone call from Professor Waterman at the University of California. Affiliated colleges, I should say. And he wanted to know if he could talk to this issue. Sheriff says, sure. Come right up. So he did. He came up. And he was pretty well advanced in Indian language all over the West. And he talked with him, or talked at him. He finally said that he got a word that Ishi recognized, or at least showed signs of that he recognized. So they sent and got another man, a supposed to be a North Yahi. Ishi was supposed to be a South Yahi from the Deer Creek tribe. This North Yahi, his name was Botwi, and he was up around Tehama. So they set up and they got him, brought him down. He was truly Indian. But when they seen one another, they didn't get along right away. They were not properly introduced, I guess, that was it, because they had no use for one another. But in a day or two, they kind of calmed down. And after he was here, now I don't recall whether it was 2 weeks or 10 days or so, but one day I brought in a load of meat, and when I just finished unloading, I looked up the street, about a half a block, and there goes the sheriff and Ishi and some men, and they're going up toward the depot. So one of the fellows came down, and I said, "What are you doing with that boy up there?" He says, "He's taking a train. They're sending him away. They're going to take him down to San Francisco." I said, "Well, I'm going to see him leave." So I just jumped in and I wrapped them old tails that I had, and up the depot went. Ishi was dressed up, he had on a straw hat, little straight brimmed straw hat. He had on a gray suit, three-piece suit, cutaway coat. He had shoes, but the only trouble was he had his shoes in his hands and standing barefooted. He didn't want no shoes. So I walked on over to where he was, and he seen me. And I think that if I would have coached him, he would have come away with me. But he recognized me as probably being a friend or something like that. The last time I seen Ishi was when he got on the Western Pacific train, walked down the aisle, and he looked out. He was looking for something. I waved to him. He had a seat. That is the last time that I seen Ishi. There's been a lot of tales told about Ishi. In this book, Ishi in Two Worlds, he was supposed to be in a corral. 4 or 5 dogs had him treed. 4 or 5 butchers come out that were armed with knives and shotguns and 6 shooters and everything. Ishi got so disgusted, according to the author, that he vomited. And that's 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. It never happened. This was 7:30 or abouts when the absolute facts were. And there's been several sporting magazines that had accounts of Ishi. People have run across them, and they would call me, "Hey, have you got Argosy? Have you got Field and Stream and so forth? The last issue?" "No." "Should I have it?" "Yes, there's quite an account in there about Ishi. You're Indian." But it's not correct. What I've just told you about Ishi is the facts as it were. There was 4 of us there that night. I'm the last one. The rest of them are gone. Even the little boy. So if you have a question, I'll try to answer it. But that's the story of Ishi.
There are only 2 more minutes. This will be a rare opportunity. If you have any questions, you can get in a quick 1 or 2. Jack?
How old did you say he was?
How old would you say he was?
I forgot to mention that. I would put him between 60 and 65 years. About 5'6" or 7", and he'd weigh about 125 or 30 pounds.
Time for another quick one. Jack?
Well, when we was watching the movie about it, it said he come back to his native hunting grounds and was showing those guys around. You know anything about that?
When we saw a movie, Ishi in Two Worlds, and that he came back, I think, in 1914, and he showed the men around his Mill Creek area. Do you know anything about that?
I missed that trip. He was taken up to Mill Creek and Deer Creek, his old stamping grounds. He had been fattened up, too. He was slick. I seen pictures of him in the Mrs. Crover's book. When he got up there, the 2 brothers had charge of the pack train that was going to take this party in on Deer Creek land where the Indians were in early days. Ishi was to guide them. Fellow with the pack train, he looked over and he says, "Is that Ishi?" "Yep." "No," he says, "that ain't Ishi." He says, "The last time I see an Ishi, he was poor and his ribs were showing." He says, "That's not Ishi." Well, he says, "It is Ishi." So they gave him a horse, and he started out up a narrow trail. That's pretty wild country, that Deer Creek Canyon. And this caravan trailed along behind. This fellow that had charge of this pack train, he came up to the place where the trail, you run out of trail with a horse. So he got off. Ishi came up and he got off. But there was a little narrow ledge alongside that canyon. Across the canyon, which was about 30 to 40 feet deep and maybe 8 to 10 feet wide in places. The walls were straight up and down. Down the bottom was Deer Creek, good fishing down there. But this fellow that I tell you about the pack train, he had no heart at it at all. He just thought this was a wild goose chase. Ishi kept going along this trail, little trail along that wall. Finally he stopped and he reached around like that. And he came out with a pole. This pole was around, what this man told me, about 5 inches thick. And he says he would judge it was about 12 feet long. And it was smooth. It had been used. Ishi laid that pole down carefully, and it fit into a notch on that side of the wall, over on this wall. Here that pole was across that canyon. Ishi throwed one leg over it, and he went right on across. This man of the train, he says, nobody in the world but Ishi could have found that pole and done what he did. He says that must be Ishi.
Okay. With that, you'll need to catch your buses. Let's give a big round of applause because I think it's great.
Thank you.
Thank you again. Would you care to show some of the pictures?
Thank you, Sonny.
That was nice.
Now this is Ishi as he looked the night that we caught him, or captured him as you want to say. This is another picture. He was a hungry-looking man that night. As you can see, there's, by the looks of his chest, his ribs show. The stump that you see in the picture is exactly where Ishi was sitting the night we picked him up. This is a picture of myself and the spot. You'll notice that the tree has, top of it is broke off, and there's not much left of the old grounds. That is part of this old slaughterhouse. That spot you see is a vat where we used to salt the hides. This is a group of scouts that I took out there for an outing. They wanted to see the spot. They were very much interested in a little talk about Ishi.